I'm Rosemary Pendant, and I'm the Government Records Ombudsman. As Ombudsman, my role is to understand GRAMA, this law, so that I can be a resource for people who are looking for government records or who are responding to records requests or making appeals. So this is part of Utah Code. It's section 63G2, and this is a copy, but it's also found on the legislature's website or on the archives website. And just to go through what it contains, the first part is general provisions. It talks about access to records, classifications, and an appeals process. And there's more, but that's kind of the basics of the law. So just to say a little bit more about this law, it was passed in 1992, and the idea at that time was to gather all of the statutes relating to records throughout Utah Code into one place so that we could have a comprehensive law that governs records. And so, as you can see, it's the Government Records Access and Management Act. So it talks about access to records and the management of records, and all of that was included. But in 2008, the legislature restructured things and recodified and created the Government Records Management Act, and all of the portions of this law that have to do with records management were then put in the Records Management Act, and what's left is only points about access. So really, this law should be the Government Records Access Act, because there's nothing left about management in here to speak of. It's all been moved. And so the things I prepared today have more to do with access than with records management. But I will, since I know you're interested in that too, we'll talk a little bit about records management as well. So the points about access, the first part of this law on the first page, it talks about the legislative intent in writing this law. So the legislative intent is says it recognizes the public right to access information about government, but at the same time recognizes individuals' rights to privacy in information that government gathers about them. So the intent is to balance when the public interest in information outweighs personal interest in privacy. Then it goes on to say that there is also public interest in restricting access to certain information. And so we want to also balance the public interest in restricting access with the public interest in providing access. And so the whole law is about how to make those decisions. So, and then it goes into these points. The purpose of the law is to promote easy and reasonable access to public records, to specify when interest in access outweighs interest in restriction, to prevent the abuse of confidentiality, and to provide guidelines for both disclosure and restriction, and then to favor public access on balance. It still has this phrase in here, to establish fair and reasonable records management practices, but as I mentioned, those have been moved to a different statute. But here's the definition of a governmental entity, because this law applies to government. Every entity that's not a governmental entity is not subject to this law. They don't have to provide access. They don't have to do all of these things. So although this description is long, it boils down basically to if you are conducting the public's business and using the public's funds to carry out that business, then you are a governmental entity, and therefore the law applies. So then there's a definition of a record. So a record, as the law defines it, is any documentary material that is prepared, owned, or received by a governmental entity where all of the information in the original is reproducible by electronic means. So that includes everything. If it's reproducible and you receive it, or you own it, or you retain it, that can include text messages, because those are reproducible if it pertains to government business. So I'm going to expand on this a little bit right now and talk a little bit about the Public Records Management Act. So the Public Records Management Act says that records, so if by definition it's a record, records are the property of the state. So governmental entities have custody of all those records, but they're the property of the state. And the law requires that you maintain all records according to approved retention schedules, that you destroy them when they have met retention, and that you maintain them according to that retention schedule. So if records are to be maintained permanently, which many of them are, then they can be transferred to the state archives at the point that they need retention. So, as Johnny mentioned, following these retention schedules is very important, not just for compliance with the law and for business, but for access as well, because if you are maintaining records beyond their retention, then you have to still provide access to them if you were to get a GRAMA request. That's just one aspect. But do you have any questions about records or what a record is or the retention schedules? Just to stop right here.
The retention schedule is what would be as far as, is there different limitations on different documents?
Yes.
So what would run that schedule as far as?
The retention schedules are found on the State Archives website. And I think if we could, at the end of the presentation, I can go back to our website and show you where the retention schedules are, and we can explore that a little bit. So let's plan on doing that. So there are a number of things in the definition of a record in GRAMA that a record is not. So a record is not a personal note or communication. So that means if, as an example, if an elected official is using a government email account or device to make personal communications with a family member or something like that, that is not a record. Any kind of personal communications that a government employee makes are not records. Same with temporary drafts and similar material. Things that they're using for their personal use are not records. So there's quite a long list, including junk mail and publications and so on.
So you have temporary draft on there or similar material. So if you have someone who is doing a temporary draft, like building different things for the county, that wouldn't be considered something that would need to be released in GRAMA. It's just a draft they're creating that's being refined and refined.
So this is, she asked if a draft that's being refined is not available through a GRAMA request. And the answer is no, it's not, because it's a draft. But a temporary draft is different in that it's temporary. It's not something that's being distributed. It's something that someone is using for their personal use. Like, for example, if the reporter is taking notes during the meeting and then she uses those notes to create minutes or create a draft of the minutes, then those notes that she made just for herself are not records. Yes?
Have you had experience with people trying to GRAMA budget discussions. The reason I asked is we used the argument this year in our county saying that budget discussions were in essence a draft and not GRAMA-able. We don't exclude anyone from the meetings, but there are decisions that have to be made that are, we feel, administrative and not necessarily GRAMA-able until, of course, the final budget or the final proposed budget is made available. But that's, until that point, we wanted to call it a draft document, the entire budget or the individual pieces of the budget. In other words, it's not necessarily GRAMA-able, only because there are decisions that still need to be made by the county executive, the commissioners on budget priorities. Have you run into that before with anybody trying to GRAMA a budget, a temporary budget or a budget, those beginning stages of the budget process?
So you're talking about records that you're discussing and working on?
Yeah, so our auditor prepared a very nice spreadsheet to prioritize, make and set budget priorities. But the argument that we made was that it was a draft.
It is a draft.
And therefore not GRAMA-able.
So it is GRAMA-able in the sense that someone can ask for it. Anyone can ask for anything, but drafts are protected, and therefore you're going to respond to the GRAMA request by denying access to it.
So basically we say because it's a temporary draft, it is not a record.
Because you're going to say because it is a draft, it is a protected record. It's actually not a temporary draft because you're working through it and multiple people are working on it. So you're just going to deny access to it. Okay?
For sure, yeah.
So, so GRAMA addresses this access issue by establishing classifications. So within the law, there are 4 classifications. And so, back to the definitions, classification means deciding this access question. Who gets access to it? And designation means a predetermination based on a set of records, what you think the classification is going to be, but classification is actually making the decision when you get a request. So the classifications are controlled, and that is very limited to psychiatric record and medical records. But private records are all of those records that are protecting an individual's personal information. So if you look at the definitions, a private record by definition is one that's listed in the law under the list of private records. So you could go to 63G 302, and that is on page 26, and there you will see a list of private records. So by definition, a private record is anything that's on that list, and you would restrict access to all of those things. The protected record is anything that's listed in 305. So a protected record is restricted because it's in the public interest to protect or restrict access. So you can see that there are like 75 different things on the list of protected records, and drafts is one of them. I believe it's number 22. So you can see when you get a request, you go to this list of protected records and you're going to restrict access to everything, anything on this list. And number 22 is drafts. That covers your temporary budget, and you would restrict access to that in the public interest. It's in your interest to restrict that access.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's records that, for instance, are abatements and stuff. They contain their financial information, disabled information, or a veteran's disability. The fact that they have an abatement is a public record. The account, the name, and how much it was is public, but the rest of it is not.
Right, because you can see those items listed on the list of private, like disabilities and things like that. So you sort of have to go to the law and figure all this out, which is not that simple. So public record means everything else that's not on those lists, or not restricted by another statute, because there really are other statutes that also govern records. HIPAA is an example. So then there's a definition for a records officer. A records officer is the individual that's appointed by a chief administrative officer in every governmental entity who is responsible to work with the state archives on the care, maintenance, scheduling, designation and classification, disposal and preservation of records. So every governmental entity, and if you go to the Public Records Management Act, there is a requirement there that every government, that the chief administrative officer of every governmental entity is required to appoint one or more records officers who are going to be responsible for classifying, responding, managing, all of those things that have to do with records, including destruction, seeing that they follow the retention schedule, everything. So note that this can be one records officer or it can be more than one, dividing the responsibilities among several people. So that's an important point.
Rosemary?
Yes.
Who watches that to make sure that every entity does have a records officer identified?
The state archives has a legal requirement to publish the name of every records officer for every governmental entity. And there is also a requirement for every records officer to be certified. So they have to annually complete online certification through the archives website. And we have to publish their name and also publish whether or not they completed their certification.
So will you cross-reference with the new register at the Lieutenant Governor's office of every single entity?
We're working on that.
Okay.
We're working on that.
And are you prepared for the hundreds of governmental nonprofits that now also will have to have records officers?
You know, I've been thinking about that. I've really been thinking about that. That is, that's something that's not really accounted for yet. Because what Johnny's talking about is that a couple of years ago, the legislature expanded the definition of a governmental entity to include nonprofits that are, the controlling interest is, public dollars. So, I don't know how that's all going to get addressed, but I'm sure that we'll get there.
So how do we find out who our records officer is?
How do you find out?
Yeah.
Now this is where, I'll go back to that again with the website and show you some things on the website when I get there. Yes,
One last question before you move on.
yes,
Can you have multiple records officers?
of course.
Okay.
Right, one or more. And so that can be structured any way you want. You can have one to answer GRAMA requests and someone else to do the management and destruction and so on. Okay. So now I'm going to go into some points that the law has about access. So the law says that every person has the right to inspect a public record free of charge during normal business hours. And then just this year in 2019, the legislature carved out some exceptions for that. Not if the record was already provided to the person, not if it's available online, and not if it's only accessible in a computer that's owned by government and that also contains restricted information that would have to be segregated. So, private, protected, and controlled records are not public records, and so this is just saying that governmental entities cannot disclose any of those records unless they do it in accordance with the law. So there's specific people that are authorized to get private records, personal records about, for example. So if it's not a public record, then you can't provide access to just anyone.
Could I ask something really quick? It was on a
Yes.
couple of slides back that says that inspecting, that someone has the right, they can take a copy of a public record during normal working hours. Is that like at no charge? Like we just have to sit and make as many copies as they want?
No,
Or then
that's-
that falls under our policy of what we, right there, yeah.
Subject to sections 203 and
I
204.
gotta read that then. Okay.
203 is about fees, and
Okay.
204 is about making a request.
Okay, thank you.
So you can charge them, and you can make them make an appointment,
Yeah.
not just show up.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. So there's several things that are carved out that government is not required to do in response to a request. You're not required to compile or format or create records where they don't exist, tailor information. You're not required to provide record in format that you don't normally maintain. But guess what? Government does this all the time. So if you decide to do those things, you may do them. You may charge for the time that you spent doing that, but you don't actually have to do it. Okay. This is more of the same that I just said. So, and then physical form cannot hinder access, and it, yes.
Rosemary, you said in there that we don't have to compile, but we receive GRAMA requests all the time that says, I want a record of this from this year to this year. So technically, we wouldn't have to, because that would consider compiling.
Technically, you don't have to. That's what it says, but
But the board may say differently.
it might say different. You had a bad experience there. So, I mean, even though the law says that, governmental entities all the time are compiling records and tailoring information and putting things together for the public. And when they do that, they can charge a fee for the time. And well, let's just back up and go with we'll come back to fees. So if a person wants a record, they're required to make a GRAMA request. So a GRAMA request has to be in writing, and it has to contain their name and address and phone number and email address if they're willing to accept communication by email. And then it has to include a description of the record that describes what is wanted with reasonable specificity, so that the records officer understands what is being asked for. So this on the slide is a form from the archives website, and that's a template that can be used for convenience. But really, it could be an email, it could be, doesn't need to be on a form, it just has to be in writing. So, a governmental entity is required to respond within 10 business days after they receive a request. And the response can be providing records, or it can be denying records. If the records officer determines that the records aren't public, that they're either private or protected or restricted, then they should deny the records. And other options are to notify the requester if you don't have the records. So like say there is a request for something that has already been destroyed according to a retention schedule, then the response would be to notify them that the records no longer exist. Or the last one is to notify the requester of extraordinary circumstances. So in the law, there's a list of extraordinary circumstances. That just means that it's going to take more than 10 days to comply with this request. So those are the possible responses. But if you, yes, Sonia?
So say you get a request, you respond to it, you provide the records, Then what if the requester comes back to you and just asks a question about something contained in your record, in those records? Do we have to respond to them, or what's your advice? Because they haven't sent the question in a formal request.
Right.
They're not asking for a record, they're just wanting us to give almost like a legal opinion or our opinion on why this record, was created or how it was created, or it's just a question.
Right, and that's not a request, and I guess you would have to choose how you would answer that, or if you would answer it, or,
Yeah, we
There's-
just haven't, we haven't responded to them when it's
That's
just a question.
that's fine. Because I've had people, because I work with both public and records officers, just yesterday, someone called and they're like, oh, I sent this list of questions, and they responded by saying I need to make a GRAMA request, but I don't want any records, I just want them to answer my questions. Right? So, well, they can think of a record that might have the answer to their question and ask for that, but if the government's choosing not to answer their questions, I mean, well, right?
Okay.
I don't know if that helped, but you would have to decide if you feel qualified to, or if you want to answer questions.
Try to determine.
Okay, so once you have a request, you can't destroy records, even if the retention has passed.
So, I have a question. So
Yes.
like, if it's a record, you've provided it to them, and then it's time to destroy it, you can.
Yes.
If you've already provided it. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So this is also new just this year in the law, and it's in response to a request that a governmental entity cannot provide a record that is received through record sharing, but instead should deny the request and inform the requester which governmental entity that record originated from. So that pertains to like law enforcement, or lots of times like police reports would be shared between governmental entities. And in the past, governments tried to work out who's providing access, but now it's clear. If any governmental entity received a record from another governmental entity, they cannot provide access to it. Yes?
Okay, so I work at an attorney's office, and our sheriff's office, when they get GRAMA requests asking for reports, they automatically send it to our office to approve, and because if we've charged it or if it's under investigation, we'll deny it, but they just give it to us to approve. And so then I give it to my attorney to review, and he approves it, I send it out. Should I not be doing that? Should we not be? They're wanting us to approve that it's okay to release that record.
Okay, so I'm a little confused about who's.
It is because they're the same governmental agency. It's okay.
the same governmental, you're the same governmental entity?
We have
Yeah.
the sheriff's office versus the attorney's office.
So she can
The
share.
same county,
Okay.
but we're releasing it for the sheriff's office. It's their record, but we're releasing it. The attorney's office is releasing it.
Okay, because the sheriff's office wants to know that you're not prosecuting something. So I think however you work it out, you're the
That's fine then.
same governmental entity.
Okay.
Okay. Failure to respond is considered a denial. So if 10 days elapses and the requester received no response, then they have a right to appeal and take this to the next level, because your failure to respond is a denial. And then fees. Government can charge a reasonable fee to cover the actual cost of staff time for compiling, formatting, manipulating, packaging, all those things that we said you don't have to do. If you do them, then you can charge a reasonable fee for the time spent doing it. You can also charge for staff time for search and retrieval. And this is more details about that. You can't charge for the first 15 minutes. You can charge for the actual cost of computer output. And after the first 15 minutes, the amount charged should be based on the salary of the lowest paid employee who would be capable of doing the work. So, political subdivisions establish fees through ordinance or formal written policy. So, it's a good idea to have a formal fee policy so that everybody knows what to expect and it's uniform. And,
Can I ask a question?
yes,
So I work in the recorder's office, and we have, like mortgage companies, they want to know the names of everybody who lives in certain places and their mailing addresses and stuff for taxes. And we were told that, because we have to compile that, it has to be made, but we can only charge the first company that asks for it, because then it's made. So everybody else just gets it. So you just don't want to be the first mortgage company that
That's
asks for it.
right.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that's right.
that's right, because it says you can charge the actual cost. So if you compiled it the first time, that was, you can charge them for doing that. But the second time, it's already there.
Okay.
So it didn't take you extra. That's why you don't
So following that logic, then the compiled data becomes its own separate record now?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
You don't have to compile it for them though.
You don't have
No.
to, you don't have to do it in a format that it's already done.
You don't have to do it in a format that you don't maintain it, but once you have it, then,
Yeah, I asked that question because that would be something you should consider if you're gonna decide to compile when you don't have to. Is once you've compiled it, now that's its own separate record that you have to keep
right.
and get.
So you have to keep what you've given out. Because if I compile something, I give it to them, I don't have it anymore. You have to keep a copy of it?
Well,
Because
there's
how
a
could she give it out
there's
to
a
other
gray.
mortgage companies
There's a
if
gray.
she?
There's a
didn't
gray, isn't
copy
it?
it?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a retention for records requests, and that is 3 years. So
That's the request itself, that's not.
that's the request itself. So I think it's kind of up to you if you want to keep a copy of what you gave them. I mean, I'm thinking.
I brought that up, that we have to keep the request for 3 years. Do we have to destroy those? Because there's individuals that will continue to ask for the same request. If they know it's after 3 years, then they go through the whole process again.
Yes.
For example, Scott Collier.
He's a great example. Right.
Do we have to destroy them after 3 years? Or is that suggested retention schedule?
This is a really good question. Because in the Public Records Management Act, it says that we're required to maintain and destroy records according to a retention schedule. But you definitely have an administrative need to keep that so that you know what's been requested. So I think I would work around that by making the request for a record part of the records series that is involved. In other words, I would keep the requests as long as I kept the records. Yes.
Talking about fees, just get yours and anybody else's thoughts. These days, there's a hot topic, you might handle in your county, and you have tons of GRAMA requests, and you have to provide all these documents and copies of everything, and you try and tell people kind of a fee of what it might be, but by the time you compile the record and get it all ready for them, and they won't pay that fee, then you've got all this information.
Stuff, yes.
Is
Right.
there any way to not do that till they pay a fee, or can you get rid of it after they refuse to pay for it, or?
So I don't have the slide here, but if you anticipate that it's going to cost more than $50, you can ask them to prepay.
Okay.
so that you're not stuck. And also, if they
You're trying to get an idea of what it would cost.
right, you're gonna estimate what you think it's going to cost and have them prepay, and then you can refund them the balance if it doesn't cost that much.
Okay. So you can collect it and refund back?
Yes,
Okay.
you can. So the subpoena is not a GRAMA request, it's a part of a court process, and so that's important. So, as I mentioned in the definitions section, there's lists of records that are public and lists of records that are private and lists of records that are protected. So the records officer's got to be able to navigate these lists and figure out what the classification should be. So the list of public records is listed as 301, and I just picked a couple of things to highlight. You know, this is certainly not exhaustive, but one of the things that is listed as a public record is for government employees, the name, gender, gross compensation, job title, job description, contact information, number of hours worked, and so on for every governmental employee, unless they're an undercover law enforcement or investigative officer. So this just means that the public has the right to know who's hired by government, why they're qualified, how many hours they're working, and that kind of stuff. That's one example. And then another example of public records is minutes, recordings, transcripts of open and public meetings, judicial records, and once there's the court restricts access, and then records that are maintained by county recorders, clerks, surveyors that document tax status or property rights. So you can look through the list, but those are a few examples. And then in the list of private records, anything that talks about unemployment or social services or welfare benefits or eligibility for those, medical data like diagnosis, treatment, medical condition, any kind of medical records. Those are examples of some private records. And for employees, their home address, social security number, insurance coverage, marital status, and payroll deductions. You can pull records, as I mentioned, are psychiatric and certain medical records that would not be accessible to the individual the record is of that. Then, moving on to protected, there's trade secrets of companies that you might have a contract with, and attorney-client privilege, so communications with an attorney, if you're seeking legal advice about something, are protected. Anything that's prepared in anticipation of litigation is protected, and we already mentioned that drafts are protected, and so that was just a really quick highlight of the couple of things in the different categories. So just to give you an idea, but the important thing is that governmental entities are responsible to classify their own records. So it's not the state archives, it's not anybody else, it's every governmental entity is responsibility to maintain their own records and to classify them. So when you get a request, it's your responsibility. So you can designate what you think a classification would be at any time, but you're not actually required to classify anything until you get a request. And you may redesignate or reclassify something at any time. So just because you decided something is protected today doesn't mean that in 2 months it's still protected. You can consider that independently each time you get a request. So, and another requirement is that whenever records contain both information that's public and information that could be private or protected, government must allow the public portion of the information to be disclosed and then restrict access to that portion that is restricted. So that means you have to be able to redact and segregate within the same record, perhaps.
And can you charge for that time?
Yes, absolutely. You can charge for that. So, then, in the next section of the law, it talks about appeals. So anytime the requester doesn't get what they want, technically, anytime they don't get what they want, if you issue a denial, then they can appeal. And the first level of appeal always goes to the chief administrative officer. So there's a person in every governmental entity who is in a high decision-making position, who's responsible for the records management program, who appoints the records officer, and that person is the person to whom the appeal goes. So an appeal will go to the chief administrative officer, and then the chief administrative officer can reevaluate the request and the different interests involved and make a fresh determination whether they think the records officer classified this properly and they want to uphold that decision, or whether they want to overturn it and then disclose access. So that's the first level of appeal. And the chief administrative officer then has 10 days to respond. And if they uphold the same decision, the same denial of access, then the person has 30 days in order to continue the appeal, either in district court or to the State Records Committee. So the State Records Committee is a 7-member body that hears these appeals. So if the appeal goes up to the State Records Committee, they will have a hearing. And at the hearing, each side, the governmental entity as well as the requester, gets an opportunity to make their argument, to present their case to the committee. The committee is an open and public meeting, and so they deliberate openly, and they will make a decision whether they uphold the governmental entity's decision or whether they overturn it. If they overturn it, then they issue
Yeah, I do too.
Do you have any comments about the records, because you were on the committee at one time?
The only issue I have, and we've discussed it before, is law enforcement is at least half, if not more, of the appeals, but there's no representation of that on the board. And it's interesting, that board, or the committee,
Right.
you know.
And you heard me stand on the soapbox and
Oh,
say,
yeah.
we need law
Oh, yeah.
enforcement. And still, they're not there. So there's a couple of citizen members, the director of state archives, and a representative of the League of Cities and Towns, and a media person, and, they do their best. But they're, as one disappointed requester mentioned, they do their best, but how can they be qualified to address all the issues that they're asked to address? But at any rate, there is that option to proceed to district court. So, I went through the law now, we've covered the whole thing, but if we go through it and think about what the law says each governmental entity must do. So, each governmental entity must have records officers. So that's really important that everyone in government knows that there's a records officer and that requests go through records officers. And like, for example, going back to law enforcement, the officers out in the field don't just pass out, or any employees don't just pass out records. They have to direct the requests for records to the records officer so that the records officer can carry out their responsibility of classifying and doing this appropriately. Yes?
What do we do about the hundreds of governmental entities that have no employees? Or if they have an employee, it might be literally the backhoe guy that digs the graves at the cemetery district. How are they supposed to have a trained records officer maintaining the records of that organization when they have no staff?
Yeah. So there's always special districts that have 3 people. Now, according to the law, there has to be at least 2 or 3 people.
The 3 volunteer board members, yeah.
Right. So one of them has to be a records officer. They have to fill that function, and training would look like them taking that certification test that the archives has online. And yeah, so when they might get a request, and maybe the requester, if they're not satisfied, would call me and I would call them and try to help them work through the process. That happens. But, yeah. So the chief administrative, this is also in the law, the chief administrative officer must ensure that the records officer or other employees who are responding to requests are properly trained. So, same question, right? How do you do that when entities are so small? Yes?
If they're responding to requests, let's say it goes to our clerk's office and it involves the road department, and they say, here's your GRAMA request, respond to it. We're not the records officer, but we have the information, so we have to have somebody in our department trained, or just?
As a records officer. Could you all hear her question? So if the GRAMA request comes in and the information is with the road department, then I'm just going to say that the records officer should get the information from the road department and should be responsible for responding to the request, instead of assigning the road department to answer.
So should the records officer be answering all the requests for the county?
Well, it depends on how you've got it broken up. If you have one records officer,
Yes.
then yes.
Send my request to
But
somebody
if you
else.
would have separate records officers for different sections, then it would work. However you navigate the assignments, because it could be one or it could be more.
I'm sure my attorney is not a records officer that answers the request though. I know the attorney assigned to it, he's not been assigned that. He's not a records officer, so that's why I'm
That's
concerned.
why
I'm
you're
wondering,
confused. Because according to the law, it's the records officer who's responsible
Yeah.
to do all these things.
yeah,
The records officer responds to the request. And the attorney's role is to provide advice to the records officer. But it does happen sometimes, the attorney just does it.
so does my attorney need to be a records officer for my office?
If he's doing the records officer's job, he should be. But really, that's not an attorney's role, in my opinion.
Awesome, I'm gonna go tell them that. This is our job.
Okay, so the next thing on the compliance checklist is that records officers must be certified annually by completing the online training. And as I mentioned, the archives has a legal mandate to publish the names of all of those records officers in whether or not they're certified. And then governmental entities should evaluate the records they maintain and report designations to the state archives. That's in the law, but it needs to be updated because the archives couldn't possibly gather all of the classifications of all of your records and actually keep track of that. And then, governmental entities must make public records available for inspection during normal business hours, and we talked about that earlier. And the chief administrative officer makes a decision on the appeal, and they can weigh the various interests. So when the chief administrative officer is making a decision on an appeal, the law gives them more latitude. It says that they can use the weighing provision, or they can weigh the interest and decide that a record is properly restricted, but that in a specific case, the interest in providing access outweigh the interest in restricting access, and so they have more latitude to overturn it. Yes.
So as a chief administrative officer that has had to answer some of these appeals, but when the requester doesn't give you any indication of what the public purpose is for the records request,
Right.
how do you do that weighting? How do I weigh the need for the public to have that data when they've not given me any indication of what the purpose that they're asking for is?
Well, in my opinion, if it's going to be in the public interest, the public has to have access to it. So you could think about if that requester is a person who is an employee of the Salt Lake Tribune or is got some other, journalistic role where they're going to publish something, that's one thing. If not, I think that the public interest is questionable, because how is it benefiting the public if the public doesn't know? Does anybody else have any thoughts about that? Okay. So the last thing, the last point about the chief administrative officer is that this appeal role can be delegated. So, Johnny, there you go. You can delegate it to me. But back to the question about small entities. So if there's a special district or something with only three board members, then if the chief administrative officer is also the records officer, or even, no matter what, if the group is that small, then I suggest that this appeal role be delegated to someone up the hierarchy. So like, if it's a cemetery district in a city, it should go up to the city, to someone in the city, in city government, or if it's a special district that's created by a county, this role could go up to the county commission or something like that. Could be delegated in that way.
Can they do that though when they're not the same entity? They're separate legal entities. Can you delegate that role to someone that's not part of your entity?
Well, how is this going to work if the records officer, the person who's managing the records, is also the chief administrative officer and answering twice? So.
Exactly. And that'll happen because if they're
That happens all the time.
one of three and they're the records officer this year, but next year they're going to be the chair, and that means they're the CAO as well.
Right, right. So, I mean, this says that you may delegate these responsibilities, and this is my interpretation, in the field, working with people, is that when that comes up, delegate it to somebody who's still in government, but who has authority over you. Like, the city has some authority over a cemetery district. No? They don't?
No.
Well, and
They
I don't
only
wrong.
appoint, they appoint the members,
Uh-huh.
but once they've done that, they are not, they do not control them. And the state auditor's office is very picky about that the county commission does not control the
Okay,
activities of a special service district that they create and appoint members to.
okay, then I'm gonna be standing corrected on this,
So I suppose you'd have to just assign that duty, if you're the chair and the records officer, you'd have to assign it to one of the other board members.
yeah, yeah,
That's as high as you can go.
yeah. Okay. So, this is just a review. You can establish fees and for the records request and political, in 701 of this law, political subdivisions can adopt policies and ordinance relating to GRAMA that are compliant with GRAMA, but, you know, contain more specificity about how you're going to apply this, including retention schedules and appeals. But if governmental entities do that, they have to report that to the state archives. So, then this is my role. I mentioned this already, but I am responsible to be familiar with GRAMA so that I can help people navigate this law. And I also can mediate disputes. So if you have a requester and there is miscommunication or it's in an appeal, then we can have a mediation meeting and I'll sit down and try to come up to a resolution. Sometimes it works and sometimes not. But, so, do you have any questions? Because if we have some time, Lynn, I'd like to go to the website for a few minutes. Do we have a little bit of time?
Oh, yes.
Yes,
Okay.
okay.
Can I ask one question while you're
Yes,
on the
yes.
website? Almost every request we get says, any and all records that have information on X.
Uh-huh.
What if you don't know what records might have, might discuss that issue? You have no idea.
Right.
If you have that record or not. How would you recommend responding to a request like that?
I would recommend that you say that that request lacks specificity and you would like them to resubmit it with some kind of dates or something more specific about what they're looking for. Because, you know, one of the first hearings that I went to was somebody requested from the University of Utah all records about L. Ron Hubbard. And, you know, any and all, that was like not specific enough. So, yeah.